What if the foods modern people dismiss as simple, boring, or outdated were never simple at all? What if some of the most powerful meals for energy, digestion, resilience, and recovery were not invented in a lab, packaged in plastic, or sold as a trend, but were already sitting in ancient kitchens thousands of years ago, because that is the part most people miss. The modern world taught us to chase complexity, more supplements, more stimulants, more engineered convenience, but traditional people did not survive harsh climates, long labor, food scarcity, and disease pressure by accident. They learned, through observation and necessity, which meals strengthened the body, which foods restored the sick, which combinations sustained life, and which ingredients quietly protected people over time. And many of those meals are still hiding in plain sight, not because they are flashy, because they work differently, slowly, deeply, biologically, the way real nourishment works. Some of the meals on this list were used to steady digestion when the gut was under stress. Some helped deliver minerals the body desperately needed. Some supported the immune system, blood sugar, inflammation, and recovery long before anyone knew words like antioxidants, prebiotics, polyphenols, or electrolytes. And by the time we get to the meal built around bitter greens and fermented dairy, and the humble lentil dish that may explain why ancient people could endure so much with so little, you will start to see these foods very differently. This is not about fantasy, it is not about miracle claims, it is about something more unsettling than that. Esalt the possibility that old world people understood the body better than modern convenience ever did. 15. The bread that was never meant to be empty. Flatbread with olive oil, herbs, and crushed grain. Most people think bread is just filler. Cheap calories, something to avoid, or something to overdo. But historically, bread was not always the nutritionally hollow product many people eat now. In old world households, bread was often dense, coarse, slow-made, mineral-rich, and paired with other living foods that changed how it affected the body. This was never just bread. Traditional grain breads in the ancient Near East were often made from barley, emmer, spelt, or whole wheat. They were stone-ground, less refined, and in many cases fermented or naturally leavened. That matters because the more intact the grain, the more fiber, magnesium, B vitamins, and phytochemicals remained in the final meal. And when grains are fermented or soaked, studies suggest this can improve digestibility and may help reduce certain anti-nutrients, making minerals easier for the body to access. Add olive oil and herbs, and this simple flatbread stops behaving like a modern processed carb bomb. Olive oil brings monounsaturated fats and polyphenols associated with cardiovascular support and lower inflammatory stress. Herbs like thyme, hyssop, oregano, or mint were not only used for flavor. Traditional cultures used aromatic herbs because they stored well, preserved food, and often had antimicrobial and digestive supportive properties. Why did that matter then? Because people lived close to physical labor, irregular food access, and digestive risk. A meal needed to do more than fill the stomach. It needed to sustain. Why does it matter now? Because many people still crash after meals, struggle with blood sugar swings, or eat bread that has been stripped of what made grain useful in the first place. A practical modern version is simple. Choose a real whole grain or naturally leavened flatbread, drizzle extra virgin olive oil, add crushed herbs, and pair it with protein or cultured dairy instead of sugar-heavy spreads. The difference is not just taste, it is metabolic behavior. The problem was never bread alone, it was what we turned it into. 14. The lentil pot. That fed empires slow-cooked lentils with onions, garlic, and herbs. Lentils are often treated like poverty food, emergency food, last choice food, but ancient people knew better. A well-made pot of lentils was one of the most intelligent meals a household could prepare. This was food built for endurance. Across old agricultural societies, lentils mattered because they stored well, cooked relatively quickly compared to other legumes, and delivered a remarkable amount of nutrition in hard times. They offered plant protein, soluble fiber, iron, potassium, folate, and a slow-release energy profile that made them one of the most practical survival foods ever cultivated. What makes lentils remarkable is not just that they feed people, it is how they feed them. Their fiber helps slow digestion and support steadier blood sugar response. Their resistant starch and prebiotic compounds may help nourish beneficial gut microbes. Their mineral content supports energy metabolism, nerve signaling, and red blood cell function. And when lentils are cooked with onions and garlic, you add sulfur compounds and polyphenols that have been studied for immune and cardiovascular support. Traditional kitchens often simmered them for a long time with herbs, roots, and whatever fat was available. That method softened the fibers, improved digestibility, and turned a humble legume into a deeply restorative meal. And this is where things change. Modern diets often leave people overfed, but undernourished. Plenty of calories, not much stability. Lentils move in the opposite direction. They are simple, but they tend to support satiety, digestion, and metabolic control in a way many processed meals do not. Make them today with olive oil, onion, garlic, cumin, coriander, or parsley. Cook them until soft. I'll add a squeeze of lemon at the end to brighten flavor and potentially improve iron absorption from the meal. Ancient people did not need a superfood label to recognize a food that kept bodies going. 13. The broth that rebuilt the weak, long-simmered bone broth with roots and herbs. Modern culture likes fast energy. Bone broth belongs to a different philosophy entirely. It is not about stimulation, it is about rebuilding. Historically, broths were what practical households made when nothing could be wasted and recovery mattered. Bones, joints, connective tissue, and scraps were simmered low and slow, extracting minerals, amino acids, and gelatin-rich compounds into something warm, digestible, and soothing. For people recovering from illness, exhaustion, cold exposure, hard labor, or digestive distress, broth made sense. It required little chewing, delivered fluids and electrolytes, and gave the body material that may help support hydration, gut comfort, and recovery. Research on broth-related compounds like glycine, proline, and gelatin suggests they play roles in connective tissue and may help support gut lining integrity, although context matters, and it is not a cure-all. Still, traditional logic was sound. A long-simmered broth with onions, garlic, celery, herbs, and roots created something larger than the sum of its parts. You got fluid, you got sodium and minerals. You got aroma that stimulated appetite in the weak, you got warmth that calmed the nervous system. And you got a base that could carry vegetables, grains, or legumes when solid meals were hard to tolerate. What mattered then was survival and restoration. What matters now is that many people live in a constant low-grade state of stress, poor digestion, dehydration, and nutrient depletion. Broth is not glamorous, but it may support exactly the systems modern life tends to wear down. Make it today with quality bones, a splash of garlic, carrots, herbs, and long simmering. Strain it or turn it into soup. Use it when the body feels drained, when appetite is low, or when you need a gentler meal. Some foods shout. Real recovery foods rarely do. 12. The fish meal that quietly protected the heart. Grilled or dried fish with herbs, oil, and wild greens. For many ancient coastal and river communities, fish was not a luxury. It was recurring medicine disguised as dinner. Most people now associate heart-supportive nutrition with supplements and branded oils. But traditional fish meals were delivering some of that logic naturally long before modern marketing existed. Fish provided concentrated protein, trace minerals, selenium, iodine in some varieties, and in fatty species, omega-3 fats that have been studied for cardiovascular, brain, and inflammatory support. Even lean fish brought a kind of nourishment that was easier to digest than some heavier meats, especially when paired with herbs, greens, and olive oil. In traditional settings, fish was often grilled, salted, dried, or stewed. These methods made it practical, durable, and deeply useful in places where food preservation could mean survival. Combined with bitter greens, it also created an interesting biological balance. Protein and minerals from the fish, polyphenols and digestive compounds from the greens, healthy fat from oil, and often lemon or vinegar to sharpen absorption and flavor. Why did that matter? Because fatigue, swelling, and recovery were not abstract concerns. People felt directly how food affected stamina and resilience. And here's the deeper reason fish still matters now. Modern diets often flood the body with inflammatory imbalance. Too much ultra-processed fat, too little mineral density, too little intact protein, too little real food. A simple fish meal can help correct that pattern. Try sardines, mackerel, or grilled white fish with olive oil, garlic, lemon, and a side of bitter greens. It is not trendy, it is strategic. Sometimes the most intelligent meal is the one modern people stopped respecting. 11. The bitter greens that woke the body up, wild greens with oil, vinegar, and garlic. Most people are trained to avoid bitter flavors. That may be one of the clearest signs of how far modern eating has drifted from traditional intelligence. Because bitterness used to mean something. Dandelion greens, chicory, arugula, mustard greens, sorrel, and other wild or semi-wild leaves were common in traditional foodways because they grew heartily, returned seasonally, and brought more than color to the plate. These greens were often used in times of transition after winter, during periods of digestive sluggishness, or when heavier food had dominated the diet. Traditional observation linked bitter greens with cleansing, stimulation, and internal relief. Modern science gives us a more grounded language for that. Bitter compounds can stimulate digestive secretions, leafy greens supply folate, potassium, magnesium, vitamin K, carotenoids, and polyphenols. Many are rich in nitrates and protective plant compounds that may help support vascular function, oxidative balance, and inflammation control. But here is what makes them especially interesting now. Modern diets are packed with sweet, soft, hyper-palatable foods that rarely ask the digestive system to do anything intelligent. Bitter greens do the opposite. They signal, they activate, they remind the body how to process. Traditionally, they were wilted in oil, mixed into soups, chopped into lentils, or eaten with vinegar and garlic. That combination still works beautifully. Fat improves absorption of certain fat-soluble nutrients. Acid brightens bitterness. Garlic adds depth and biologically active sulfur compounds. And if this sounds too simple, that is exactly the point. Northern traditional wisdom did not chase complicated solutions first. It used recurring foods that gently supported the body over time. The flavor many people reject may be the signal their body has been missing. 10. The fermented milk that changed the gut-cultured yogurt with herbs, cucumbers, or grains. The modern wellness world talks constantly about the microbiome as if it were discovered yesterday. Traditional households were feeding it generations ago. Fermented dairy was one of the oldest practical technologies in food history. It extended shelf life, improved texture, changed flavor, and in many cases made milk easier to digest. Yogurt, cultured milk, and similar preparations were not luxury products. They were living foods woven into daily life. What makes this remarkable is how well traditional use lines up with current biological interest. Fermentation changes food. It breaks down certain compounds, produces beneficial acids, and introduces microbial activity that has been studied for digestive and immune support. Yogurt can provide protein, calcium, and depending on how it is made, live cultures that may help support gut balance. In traditional settings, yogurt was rarely eaten as dessert. It was mixed with herbs, used in sauces, thinned into drinks, spooned over grains, or paired with cucumbers, garlic, and mint. That matters because it kept the food savory, functional, and integrated into balanced meals rather than sugar-heavy treats. Why did it matter then? Because stomach comfort, hydration, and food preservation were everyday concerns. Why does it matter now? Yeah, because many people live with bloating, digestive irregularity, and diets that undermine microbial diversity. A practical version today is plain cultured yogurt with cucumber, mint, olive oil, and a little salt, or yogurt over lentils and grains. Choose unsweetened, livu culture versions when possible. And here is a good place to pause. If you are realizing how many ancient foods were built around digestion rather than indulgence, that is not accidental. That was intelligence earned the hard way. If one of these meals surprises you most, leave it in the comments, because the foods still ahead only get more revealing. The gut was never an afterthought. Traditional people ate like they knew that. 9. The olive oil meal that protected more than hunger. Olives, oil, herbs, and simple vegetables. Olive oil has been so commercialized that many people no longer see what made it extraordinary. They see branding. Ancient households saw protection. This was one of the most important staple fats in Mediterranean and Near Eastern food traditions for a reason. It preserved energy, carried flavor, improved satiety, and turned otherwise modest plant foods into more complete meals. But beyond calories, olive oil brought a dense package of monounsaturated fats and polyphenols that research has associated with cardiovascular support, inflammatory balance, and cellular protection. Whole olives added even more texture and plant compounds, especially when traditionally cured. Historically, oil was poured over bread, lentils, greens, fish, beans, and vegetables. It was not a side note, it was a delivery system. And fat improves the absorption of certain carotenoids and fat-soluble vitamins from vegetables. It also slows gastric emptying, which can help meals feel more stable and satisfying. That mattered in labor-heavy lives where energy needed to last. It matters now in a different way. Many people eat fat in its most distorted forms: deep-fried seed oil-heavy products, ultra-processed snacks, and low-nutrient convenience foods. Olive oil offers a very different metabolic conversation. Use it generously but intelligently, over beans, cooked greens, tomatoes, fish, soups, and whole grains. Pair it with real food, not just empty starch. A good fat does more than add calories. It changes the entire meal. 8. The egg and herb meal that delivered hidden strength eggs cooked with onions, greens, and fragrant plants. Eggs are often reduced to a fitness cliché or a breakfast habit. Traditional cultures understood them more broadly. They were compact nourishment. An egg carries a surprising amount of biological architecture: complete protein, choline, fat-soluble nutrients, selenium, and compounds important for nerve function, cellular membranes, and metabolic health. When hens were raised traditionally and eggs were eaten with vegetables and herbs, the meal became even more effective. Historically, eggs were often cooked with onions, leeks, wild greens, dill, parsley, or garlic. These combinations mattered because they brought minerals, sulfur compounds, flavonoids, and fiber to an already nutrient-dense base. The result was not just protein. It was a highly usable, highly satisfying meal that worked for recovery, in steadier energy, and practical nourishment. Why did that matter then? Because small foods had to do large jobs. Why does it matter now? Because many people eat in a way that spikes energy and then collapses it. Eggs, especially when balanced with greens and oil, tend to do the opposite. A simple modern version: olive oil, onions, chopped greens, herbs, and softly cooked eggs. Eat it with sourdough or lentils instead of processed toast or sugar-heavy breakfast foods. This is the kind of meal that does not look powerful until you understand what the body is actually receiving. 7. The fig and nut table, food. That restored the tired fresh or dried figs with walnuts, almonds, and cultured dairy. Some foods were valued not just because they sustained labor, but because they helped restore people after it. Figs were one of those foods. In the ancient world, figs were portable energy. They stored well when dried, carried natural sugars alongside fiber and minerals, and could be paired with nuts or cultured dairy for a more balanced effect. This made them useful for travelers, workers, and households looking for a practical way to build strength without elaborate preparation. What makes figs interesting is not that they are sweet, it is that, unlike many modern sweets, they bring something with the sweetness: fiber, potassium, polyphenols, trace minerals. When combined with nuts, the meal becomes more stable. Fats and proteins slow the sugar hit, while nuts add magnesium, vitamin E, and compounds associated with vascular and brain support. Traditional people understood this without biochemistry. They knew which foods gave fast energy but also stayed with you. And this is where modern thinking often goes wrong. We treat all sweetness as identical. It is not. Context matters. A handful of dried figs eaten beside walnuts and plain yogurt is biologically very different from a refined pastry or candy bar. Use figs as a recovery food, a small meal, or an evening plate with nuts and cultured dairy. Not a binge, a balance. Sometimes the forgotten wisdom is not in removing food, it is in recombining it the right way. 6. The barley bowl that kept people alive. Barley porridge or grain bowls with oil, herbs, and legumes. Barley rarely gets celebrated now, which is strange considering how long it helped feed civilizations under pressure. This grain thrived where other crops failed, it tolerated difficult conditions, it stored well, and it produced meals that were deeply stabilizing. In many Old World food traditions, barley showed up as porridge, coarse bread, soups, and grain bowls because it made practical sense. But its value goes beyond history. Barley is rich in beta-glucans, a type of soluble fiber studied for cholesterol support, blood sugar regulation, and satiety. It also offers B vitamins, minerals, and a slow-release energy profile that fits the rhythm of real work far better than refined grains. Traditional people did not need to know the term glycemic response to know that some grains held them longer and steadied them better. Cook barley with broth. Add lentils, onions, olive oil, herbs, and maybe a spoon of yogurt on top. That one bowl gives the body fiber, protein, minerals, and a digestive pace that modern processed foods rarely provide. Why did it matter then? Because hunger had consequences. Why now? Because instability still does. It just wears different clothes, cravings, crashes, over-snacking, metabolic strain. Barley is the kind of food the modern world overlooks because it is too plain to market aggressively. But plain is often where the real power hides. 5. The garlic and onion base. That ancient kitchens trusted slow-cooked onions, garlic, herbs, and oil as a healing foundation. Before supplements, before wellness branding, before people isolated compounds and put them into capsules, households built health into the base of the meal. Few ingredients show that more clearly than garlic and onion. Across traditional cuisines, these two were everywhere, not because they were fashionable, because they were useful. They stored well, they made hard foods taste better, they helped preserve meals. And traditional healing systems repeatedly used them in food for respiratory comfort, digestion, circulation, and resilience. Modern science has spent years studying sulfur-containing compounds in allium vegetables, including allicin-related activity from garlic and antioxidant compounds in onions. Research suggests they may help support cardiovascular health, microbial balance, and inflammatory regulation. They are not magic bullets, but they are exactly the kind of quietly effective food tools that become powerful through repetition. That is the key. Ancient health was often cumulative, daily, embedded. A pot of lentils begins with onion and garlic, broth begins there, greens taste better with them, fish becomes more digestible and satisfying beside them. In other words, these were not occasional add-ons. They were part of the architecture of nourishment. Cook them gently in olive oil, not to death, but until fragrant and soft. Use them as the foundation of soups, beans, grains, and vegetables. A culture reveals its intelligence in what it repeats. Traditional kitchens repeated this for a reason. 4. The pomegranate plate that defended the body. Quietly pomegranate with herbs, yogurt, grains, or salads. Some foods survive in memory because they are beautiful. Pomegranate survived because it was more than beautiful. Its deep color hinted at something ancient. People could not name chemically, but clearly recognized functionally. This fruit did something. Traditional cultures valued pomegranate for refreshment, digestion, preservation, and vitality. Its juice, seeds, and even rind had uses in various old medical traditions. Today, science points to its rich polyphenol profile, including compounds studied for antioxidant activity, vascular support, and inflammatory balance. What matters here is not hype, it is pattern recognition. Brightly pigmented plant foods often carry protective compounds, and pomegranate is one of the densest examples in traditional diets. But the real power comes in the way it was used, not as candy, not as syrup-loaded novelty. It was paired with savory food, scattered over grains and herbs, mixed into cultured dishes, or eaten fresh in season. That means its acids, fiber, and polyphenols were entering meals in a whole food context. Why did that matter then? It refreshed heavy diets and preserved value through seasonality. Why now? Because many people consume fruit in its most distorted forms: juice concentrates, sugar bombs, oozed or flavorings without substance. Add pomegranate seeds to yogurt, chopped herbs, barley, lentils, or cucumber salads. Use the whole seed, not just sweetened juice. Some foods protect the body loudly, others do it in silence and color. 3. The honey and herb remedy meal raw. Honey used carefully with nuts, yogurt, and medicinal plants. Honey is one of the easiest foods to misunderstand. Modern people see sweetness and assume indulgence. Traditional cultures saw preservation, energy, wound care, and strategic nourishment. Honey mattered because it was shelf-stable, antimicrobial in certain contexts, and potent enough that a little could go a long way. Now, to be clear, honey is still a concentrated sugar and should be used carefully, especially for people managing blood sugar concerns. But that is only part of the story. Our raw honey also contains trace enzymes, plant-derived compounds, and has been studied for antimicrobial effects and soothing roles, especially in the throat and upper respiratory context. Historically, it was not poured recklessly over everything. It was used with intention, in small amounts with nuts, fermented dairy, herbal preparations, or restorative foods. That context matters enormously. A spoon of raw honey stirred into plain yogurt with crushed walnuts, cinnamon, and a few herbs is a very different nutritional experience from processed sweets. One may support satiety and provide useful compounds. The other simply overloads the system. And here is where things get interesting. Traditional wisdom often did not reject sweetness entirely. It placed it inside a structure the body could handle. Why? That might be one of the most needed lessons today. The issue is often not the ancient food, it is the modern excess. 2. The goat milk and herb meal for strength and recovery. Cultured goat dairy with grains, greens, and aromatic plants. In many traditional regions, goat milk and goat dairy played an important role because goats could survive on difficult terrain where larger livestock struggled. That practical reality shaped food culture. But over time, people also noticed something else. Some found goat dairy easier to tolerate than other forms. This was never universal, and individual tolerance varies. But traditional use remained widespread for a reason. Goat dairy can provide protein, calcium, fats, and bioavailable nutrients. And fermented versions may be easier to digest for some people because fermentation alters lactose and protein structures. In traditional meals, cultured goat yogurt or soft cheese was often paired with herbs, grains, cucumbers, olives, or cooked greens, creating a balanced plate rather than a heavy dairy load. Why did that matter then? Because strong bones, recovery, nourishment for children and elders, and practical digestion all mattered inside resource-limited households. Why now? Because many people are either overloaded with highly processed dairy products or avoid all dairy without exploring forms that may work better for them. A practical version today is plain cultured goat yogurt with mint, cucumber, olive oil, and a side of lentils or barley, or soft goat cheese with herbs and bitter greens. This is not about nostalgia. Well, it is about remembering that traditional diets were often more nuanced than modern dietary tribes. And that brings us to the final meal, the one that ties everything together. 1. The ancient restorative bowl that modern people forgot: lentils, bitter greens, cultured yogurt, olive oil, garlic, herbs, and grain. The most powerful meal on this list is not one ingredient. It is a pattern, because that is how traditional intelligence usually worked. Not in isolated miracle foods, in combinations. Imagine the bowl: slow-cooked lentils for fiber, minerals, and steady energy. Bitter greens for digestive signaling, folate, and plant defense compounds. Cultured yogurt for protein and gut-supportive fermentation. Olive oil for satiety, absorption, and anti-inflammatory polyphenols, garlic and herbs for flavor, microbial pressure, salt, and functional chemistry, a spoon of barley or whole grain for added stability. At first glance, it looks almost too humble to matter. That is exactly why most people miss it. But biologically, this bowl is doing extraordinary work. It is supporting blood sugar control better than a refined meal. It is delivering prebiotic fiber and fermented food in the same sitting. It is feeding the gut while calming the urge to overeat. It is supplying minerals the nervous system, muscles, and metabolism actually use. It is helping the body receive nourishment without chaos. Historically, meals like this were not status symbols. They were common, repeated, seasonal, adjustable. They worked in times of labor, modest abundance, and recovery. They were not primitive, they were observant. And this is the hardest truth for the modern world to accept. Many of the foods we call old-fashioned were not left behind because they failed. They were replaced because convenience was louder. But convenience does not always understand the body. This bowl does. Make it at home. A lentil base, sautéed greens, plain yogurt or cultured goat dairy, olive oil, garlic, fresh herbs, a grain if desired. Eat it slowly. Notice how different full feels when the meal is built by wisdom instead of impulse. Sometimes the real revelation is not a new discovery. It is a forgotten combination. The deeper lesson here is bigger than any single meal. Ancient people were not eating this way because they had perfect science. They were eating this way because they paid attention. They noticed which foods restored strength after sickness, which meals steadied energy through long days, which combinations supported digestion, resilience, and survival. Over generations, that observation became tradition. And now, modern research is catching pieces of it. Not all of it, not perfectly, but enough to reveal something important. Old world food knowledge was often far more sophisticated than modern culture gives it credit for. The real divide is not ancient versus modern. It is observant eating versus distracted eating. Real nourishment versus edible convenience. Combinations that support the body versus products that merely entertain it. So the next time someone calls these foods ordinary, remember what ordinary once meant. It meant repeated, proven, relied on. It meant people trusted these meals with energy, recovery, digestion, and life itself. That is not primitive. That is intelligence. Which of these ancient meals surprised you the most, and which one would you actually try first? Put it in the comments, and subscribe, because the next video goes even deeper into the forgotten plants and kitchen ingredients traditional people used when food itself had to function like medicine.